They say loyalty runs deeper than blood in the Bikie world. But what happens when that loyalty is tested by betrayal, murder, and the pursuit of power? In May 2024, the largest mass resignation in Australian underworld history sent shockwaves through the criminal landscape. 36 members of Australia's largest Bikie gang, the Rebels Motorcycle Club, walked away from everything they had built and everything they had sworn to protect. They kept their Harleys as a final insult. They abandoned their patches in an act of defiance that would change the Bikie world forever. This was not just a resignation. It was a declaration of war from within. Tonight, we uncover the dark secrets behind the internal collapse that is tearing apart one of Australia's most powerful criminal empires, a story of greed, suspicion, and ultimate betrayal. One that began with a single sniper's bullet fired into the darkness of a Perth racetrack. To understand how Australia's largest Bikie gang began to collapse from the inside, we need to go back to a time when the rebels ruled the underworld like kings. Founded in Brisbane in 1969, the Rebels Motorcycle Club grew from a small group calling themselves the Confederates into a criminal empire spanning continents. At their peak, they controlled more than 70 chapters across Australia and had over 1,000 patched members, making them the largest outlaw motorcycle gang in the country. Their patches told the story of their power, a Confederate flag emblazoned with a skull wearing a cap, and the infamous 1% symbol, marking them as outlaws who lived outside society's rules. Their motto said it all: rebels forever, forever rebels. For decades, that bond appeared unbreakable. The man who built this empire was Alex Vella, known in the underworld as the Maltese Falcon. Born in Malta in 1953, Vella arrived in Australia as a teenager and quickly made his mark. He was a boxer, a businessman, and eventually the national president who transformed the rebels from street-level thugs into sophisticated crime figures. Vella understood something many gang leaders did not. The real money was not in constant street violence. It was in building networks, trafficking drugs, laundering money, and running legitimate businesses that could clean dirty cash. The rebels did not just control territory, they controlled markets. By the early 2000s, police believed the gang was involved in everything from methamphetamine trafficking to extortion. In South Australia alone, authorities reported that as much as 80% of nightclubs and bars in Adelaide used security companies linked to Bikie gangs, with the rebels at the center of that web. But empires built on violence and greed often carry the seeds of their own destruction. In 2014, Alex Vella's reign came to an abrupt end when Australian immigration authorities cancelled his visa while he was visiting Malta. The Maltese Falcon was stranded overseas, unable to return to the kingdom he had built. The question was simple but dangerous. Who would inherit the throne? With Alex Vella stuck in Malta, power passed to his nephew, Damien Vella. At just 43 years old, Damien found himself at the helm of one of Australia's most feared criminal organizations. But ruling an empire from Sydney while trying to control chapters spread across a continent the size of the United States proved far more difficult than anyone expected. The true power base of the rebels was not in Sydney. It was more than 3,200 kilometers away in Western Australia, where a man named Nick Martin had built his own kingdom. Nick Martin was not just the Western Australian president of the rebels. He was a legend in the Australian underworld. Tough, charismatic, and ruthless, Martin had survived assassination attempts and violent gang wars. At times, he even stepped in as acting national president, a towering figure who commanded loyalty through fear and respect in equal measure. In Western Australia, Martin ruled like a medieval lord. Members paid their dues directly to him. He lived in a mansion, drove luxury cars, and was known for spending club money freely on his lifestyle. Some whispered about missing funds and expensive renovations, but no one dared to question Nick Martin openly. One man understood that reality better than most. For more than a decade, Karl Lebruy served as Martin's sergeant-at-arms, his right-hand man in Western Australia. Lebruy had joined the rebels 25 years earlier and climbed the ranks through unwavering loyalty. He was Martin's enforcer, his financial manager, and arguably the most trusted figure in the WA chapters. But in the Bikie world, trust is a dangerous currency. Everything changed on the night of December 12, 2020, at the Perth Motorplex in Kwinana. Nick Martin was watching drag racing with his wife Amanda, surrounded by thousands of families.
Then, at exactly 8:33 p.m., a single rifle shot cracked through the night air. The bullet, fired from 335 meters away, struck Martin in the left side of his chest. His final words, spoken to his wife as she desperately tried to perform CPR, were simple and devastating. "Babe, I've been shot." Nick Martin died in Amanda's arms as children screamed and families ran for cover. The king of the Western Territories was dead, killed by a professional sniper in the most public assassination in Australian criminal history. The assassination of Nick Martin was not a random act of violence. It was a carefully planned execution that exposed a deadly new reality within Australian organised crime. Police launched Operation Rel, one of the most intensive investigations ever conducted in Western Australia. What they uncovered was chilling in its precision and brutality. The shooter was a 35-year-old former Army sharpshooter with combat experience in Iraq. He worked for an organization known as Shadows of Hope, described as operating in conflict zones around the world. This was not a street criminal acting on impulse. This was a professional assassin for hire. According to investigators, the man who ordered the hit was David James Pye, a former rebels member who had defected to the rival Comancheros motorcycle club. Pye allegedly offered $150,000 for Martin's death, making it one of the largest murder contracts in Australian criminal history. The planning was meticulous. The assassin spent weeks studying Martin, analyzing his social media activity, conducting surveillance on his home, and even flying a drone over the property to assess security measures. He visited the Perth Motorplex multiple times, learning the layout, tracking Martin's usual seating position, and calculating the perfect firing location. On December 12th, the killer entered the Motorplex as an ordinary spectator. Later that evening, he left to retrieve his weapon. Dressed in camouflage, he cut through a hole in the perimeter fence he had prepared earlier and crawled into position within thick vegetation. For 10 to 15 minutes, he watched Nick Martin through the scope of his Tikka rifle, waiting for the right moment. Around him, more than 2,000 people were enjoying a family night out, completely unaware that a professional sniper was preparing to fire on one of Australia's most notorious crime figures. The single shot that killed Martin also wounded Ricky Chapman, the boyfriend of Martin's stepdaughter, who was struck by bullet fragments. A 5-year-old child was sitting just behind Martin when the shot was fired. The assassin escaped during the chaos, but he made one critical mistake. Weeks later, he took the rifle to a licensed gunsmith and requested a barrel replacement. That decision ultimately led investigators directly to him. In March 2021, police arrested him at his home in Wickepin. In December of the same year, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with a minimum of 18 years, after pleading guilty to murder. He later agreed to testify against David Pye, who still faces trial for allegedly orchestrating the killing. But Martin's death created a power vacuum that would tear the rebels apart from the inside. With Nick Martin gone, Karl Lebruck found himself in an impossible position. As Martin's trusted sergeant-at-arms, he became responsible for the financial affairs of the Western Australian chapters. What he discovered would place him on a direct collision course with National President Darren Vella and ultimately contribute to the club's internal collapse. The first problem was immediate. The rebels' WA operations ran almost entirely on cash. Martin had demanded that members pay monthly dues in cash, partly because banks had closed his accounts due to his criminal reputation. This left hundreds of thousands of dollars stored in safes, car boots, and hidden locations across Perth. Lebruck later testified that Martin was not transparent with club finances, describing his leadership style as closer to a dictatorship. Members suspected that large amounts of money had gone missing, possibly used to fund renovations on Martin's luxury home. Tensions over finances were so severe that the Rockingham City chapter had already broken away from the rebels before Martin's death, re-emerging as the Mongols. After the assassination, Lebruck attempted to bring order to the chaos. He introduced a system where cash amounts of $10,000 to $20,000 were counted, verified, sealed, and stored. With no bank accounts available, the money was kept in safes at his home. But personal circumstances complicated matters. Lebruck's partner was suffering from postnatal depression and at one point threatened to burn the cash, highlighting just how unstable and dangerous the situation had become. For security reasons, he began moving large sums of cash to different locations for storage. That decision would later come back to haunt him. On December 28, 2022, police stopped Lebruck's BMW in Ridgewood and made a startling discovery. Sitting on the back seat was $27,850 in cash, wrapped in Christmas paper like a festive gift. Hours later, officers raided the home of Kelly Kersley, a member of a well-known racing family and a close friend of Lebruck's partner. Inside, they uncovered another $247,700, vacuum-sealed in plastic bags. In total, police seized $455,550 in cash, all packaged in a manner that suggested criminal activity rather than legitimate club business. Lebruck was charged with possessing stolen or unlawfully obtained property. He maintained that the money belonged to the rebels and was being set aside to fund a high court challenge against Western Australia's strict anti-Bikie laws. Prosecutors, however, argued that the way the cash was stored and concealed pointed to something far more troubling. The case dragged on for more than a year as Lebruck fought the charges in court. Meanwhile, in Sydney, National President Darren Vella was growing increasingly suspicious. Police sources believe individuals linked to Vella demanded transcripts of Lebruck's court appearances, wanting to know exactly what was being said about the club's finances. This was not simple curiosity. It was a direct challenge to Lebruck's integrity, and a suggestion that he could no longer be trusted with the club's most sensitive matters. For a man who had devoted 25 years of his life to the rebels and who had served as Nick Martin's most trusted lieutenant, the implication was devastating. While Karl Lebruck was fighting legal battles in Perth, Darren Vella was dealing with his own crisis of loyalty on the East Coast. The year 2022 proved catastrophic for the Vella family, and by extension, the rebels' national leadership. Early that year, Gino Vella, Darren's cousin and a respected rebels member, died suddenly in New South Wales. The loss deeply affected the family, but what followed would shock the Bikie world even more. At Gino's funeral in January, his son Jesse Vella stood before mourners and delivered what appeared to be a heartfelt tribute to both his father and the club. Speaking through grief, Jesse read a poem that included the club's sacred motto, Rebels forever, forever rebels. The words seemed to cement his loyalty to the organization that had shaped his family for generations. As the nephew of former national president Alex Vela and cousin of current president Darren Vela, Jesse was Bikie royalty. His allegiance appeared unquestionable. But in the underworld, loyalty can be fleeting. Just months after declaring eternal devotion to the rebels, Jesse Vela stunned the criminal world by defecting to the Comancheros, the rebels' most bitter rivals. Photos soon surfaced on social media showing Jesse wearing Comanchero colors and posing with their new president, Alex Mihailovich. The betrayal was personal, professional, and deeply symbolic. When Bikie royalty switches sides, it sends a powerful message. No loyalty is sacred, and no alliance is permanent. For Darren Vela, Jesse's defection was more than a family betrayal. It was a direct threat to his authority and a potential trigger for war between Australia's two most powerful outlaw motorcycle gangs. Police feared the switch could ignite a violent conflict as both organizations repositioned for dominance. The defection also emboldened other members who were already questioning the direction of the club under Vela's leadership. If someone like Jesse Vela could abandon the rebels, what did that say about the club's future? Yet these Eastern betrayals would pale in comparison to what was unfolding in the West, where Carl Labrook's patience with Sydney's leadership was reaching its breaking point. The final straw for Labrook and the Western Australian chapters came during the rebels' brutal conflict with the Mongols. The war exposed a fatal disconnect between Sydney's leadership and the members actually fighting on the streets. The Mongols had established a presence in Perth. After defecting rebels, members formed a new chapter. This conflict was not just about territory. It was personal. These were former brothers who had turned their backs on the club, and in the Bikie world, such betrayals demand retaliation. What followed was a vicious tit-for-tat war marked by drive-by shootings, firebombings, and constant violence across Perth's western suburbs. Rebels members were arrested, charged, and sentenced to lengthy prison terms for their roles in the conflict. But this is where the story takes a darker turn. While WA rebels were going to prison for defending the club's reputation, the national leadership in Sydney provided little support for their families or legal defense. In Bikie culture, this represents the ultimate betrayal. When a member goes to prison for the club, the organization is expected to support his family, cover legal costs, and ensure he is not abandoned. It is an unwritten code that keeps the entire system functioning. According to police sources, Labrook was appalled by the lack of support given to members jailed during the Mongols' war. These were not expendable foot soldiers. They were his friends, his chapter brothers, men who had risked everything for the rebels' standing in Western Australia. The belief that Sydney leadership was abandoning the WA chapters created resentment far deeper than personal disputes. It struck at the core of what it meant to be a rebel. The idea that the club looks after its own, no matter the cost. When Darren Vela's associates began demanding transcripts of Labrook's court case and questioning his integrity over the seized cash, it was the final insult. Here was a man who had given 25 years to the club, who had served as Nick Martin's closest lieutenant, and who had tried to impose financial transparency after Martin's death. And now, Sydney was treating him like a criminal. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty flowed upward to Sydney, but support never flowed back down to the chapters doing the real work. For Labrook, the decision became inevitable. If Sydney was unwilling to support the Western Australian chapters, then the WA chapters would have to support themselves. The rebellion began quietly, as the most dangerous revolutions often do. In the weeks leading up to May 2024, Karl Lebruck held private conversations with senior figures across the WA chapters. The message was simple, but devastating. Sydney had abandoned them, and it was time to abandon Sydney. What followed was unprecedented in Australian criminal history. 36 members of the Rebels Motorcycle Club, nearly the entire Western Australian membership, formally resigned in a coordinated mass exodus. But this was not simply about walking away. It was about sending a message that would reverberate through every clubhouse in the country. In the bikie world, leaving a club usually means surrendering everything. Your patch, your colors, your identity as a member are returned in a ritual designed to humiliate defectors and preserve the club's authority. The WA rebels did something different. They kept their Harleys. This was no accident or oversight. It was a deliberate insult, a calculated act of defiance aimed directly at Darren Vella and the Sydney leadership. Police sources described it as a final rebuke from men who believed they had been betrayed by the organization they had served for decades. The impact was immediate and devastating. Western Australia had been a rebels' stronghold for years, one of the club's most powerful and profitable territories. Almost overnight, that presence collapsed. Police estimated that fewer than a dozen committed fee-paying members remained in WA, most of them tied to the once dominant Southwest chapter. For Darren Vella, this was far more than a membership issue. It was an existential threat to his leadership and to the future of the club itself. If WA could successfully break away, what would stop other states from following? The rebels had always ruled through fear and strength, but now they appeared divided and vulnerable. The timing could not have been worse. Vella was already grappling with internal dissent, following Jesse Vella's defection to the Comancheros, as well as mounting pressure from law enforcement across multiple states. Now, he faced the largest mass resignation in Australian underworld history, but Karl Lebruck was not finished. After walking away from 25 years of his life, he was about to make another decision that would send shockwaves through the criminal world. The underworld waited to see what would happen to the 36 former rebels. Would they form a new club? Step away from the bikie world entirely? Or take a far more dangerous path? The answer came in June 2024, when Karl Lebruck walked into a Perth courthouse wearing black and gold, the colors of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club. The gesture was subtle, but the impact was explosive. Lebruck, the man who had served as Nick Martin's right-hand figure for more than a decade, was openly aligning himself with the rebels' most bitter rivals. This was not just personal revenge. It was strategic warfare. The Comancheros are widely regarded as one of Australia's most feared organised crime groups, linked to violent gang conflicts in Sydney that left nearly 20 people dead in recent years. They are disciplined, ruthless, and highly strategic in their pursuit of power. For the Comancheros, recruiting Karl Lebruck was a major coup. He brought with him 25 years of inside knowledge, rebels operations, financial systems, leadership structures, and criminal networks. He knew their strengths, their weaknesses, and most importantly, their secrets. Senior Comanchero figures flew to Perth almost immediately after the mass resignation, holding closed-door meetings with Lebruck and other disaffected former rebels. The recruitment process was swift, but selective. Within weeks, at least 6 former WA rebels had patched over, though the club made it clear that even experienced Bikies would need to prove themselves as nominees before earning full membership. This was not an act of charity. It was a calculated business decision designed to test loyalty and minimize risk. The strategic consequences were staggering. Western Australia had shifted almost overnight from rebels' territory to a potential Comanchero stronghold. A balance of power that had defined Australian organized crime for decades was being rewritten in real time. Police braced for violent retaliation. In the Bikie world, mass defections are often answered with force as abandoned organizations attempt to reassert dominance and prevent further collapse. But the violence never came. The rebels were simply too weakened, too fractured to respond effectively. All they could do was watch as their former stronghold disintegrated and their rivals grew stronger. The collapse of the rebels' Western Australian empire sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide. Officers who had spent years mapping the territories and alliances of outlaw motorcycle gangs were suddenly confronted with a completely new criminal landscape. In August 2024, Carl Labrook was finally sentenced on the money laundering charges that had helped ignite his conflict with Sydney's leadership. He received 14 months in prison, with eligibility for parole after 7 months. Legally, the sentence was modest, but compared to the organizational earthquake he had triggered, the courtroom outcome was almost irrelevant. During his trial, Labrook delivered explosive testimony that exposed the inner workings of the rebels in unprecedented detail. His revelations about Nick Martin's financial management, the suspected misuse of club funds, and the authoritarian leadership culture painted a familiar picture. These were not disciplined brotherhoods immune to corruption, but organizations plagued by the same greed, power struggles, and internal decay that destroy legitimate businesses. As Labrook testified, law enforcement agencies across Australia were forced to confront a rapidly changing reality. The Australian Federal Police, state police forces, and specialist anti-Bikie task forces had to reassess years of intelligence and operational planning. The Comancheros' sudden expansion into Western Australia was not just a shift in membership. It represented a strategic takeover of one of the country's most valuable criminal markets. Western Australia's mining wealth, geographic isolation, and access to major ports make it a prime environment for drug trafficking, money laundering, and large-scale organized crime. But the most significant impact of the WA defection was psychological. For decades, the Bikie world had operated on the belief that loyalty was absolute and betrayal was unforgivable. The Western Australian breakaway shattered that illusion. It proved that even the most powerful and established organizations can collapse from within when leadership fails to honor its obligations to its members. Across the country, other clubs began to experience internal strain as members questioned whether their leaders would stand by them in moments of crisis. The rebels' internal collapse exposed the fragility of empires built on fear rather than genuine loyalty and mutual protection. By 2025, the Australian Bikie landscape looked radically different from just 2 years earlier. The rebels, once the largest and most dominant motorcycle club in the country, had been reduced to a shadow of their former power. The consequences of the Western Australian collapse rippled far beyond one state. The successful defection of an entire region emboldened dissent elsewhere. Reports emerged of internal disputes in other states, with members openly challenging leadership decisions and demanding stronger support for those facing legal pressure. Darren Vella's position as national president grew increasingly unstable. The man who had inherited the throne from his uncle now presided over a fractured organization where loyalty could no longer be assumed. Meanwhile, the Comancheros capitalized on their expansion into Western Australia, solidifying their reputation as Australia's most formidable outlaw motorcycle gang. By recruiting experienced former rebels, they gained immediate operational strength, local knowledge, and credibility in a new territory. police agencies began to observe major shifts in criminal behavior nationwide. Drug trafficking routes were redirected, money laundering networks were restructured, and territorial tensions intensified as the balance of power continued to evolve. Even the Australian Capital Territory emerged as an unexpected flashpoint. With fewer anti-consorting laws and restrictions on gang insignia, the ACT attracted outlaw motorcycle gangs from across the country. By 2024, police confirmed the presence of at least 4 rival groups operating in the territory, raising fears of renewed turf violence similar to conflicts seen years earlier. The cost of monitoring these developments was significant. ACT police alone spent an estimated $400,000 in resources and overtime during 2024, underscoring the broader economic and social impact of the underworld's instability. The story of the rebels' internal war is ultimately a story about betrayal. Not just personal betrayal, but the breakdown of the unwritten social contract that holds criminal organizations together. Carl Labrook's transformation from trusted lieutenant to rival gang member was not driven by ambition or greed. It was driven by a collapse of trust between leadership and membership. When the Sydney leadership failed to support Western Australian members during their war with the Mongols, they violated a code that has kept outlaw motorcycle gangs functioning for generations. When they questioned Labrook's integrity over funds he was managing after Nick Martin's assassination, they severed faith with a man who had dedicated 25 years of his life to the club. The consequences were swift and irreversible. The largest mass resignation in Australian underworld history did not happen because of police crackdowns or court cases. It happened because an organization forgot how to look after its own people. Today, Carl Labrook serves his sentence knowing that his rebellion permanently altered the structure of Australian organized crime. An empire built over more than 5 decades collapsed in a matter of weeks because its leadership confused fear with loyalty and control with strength. The Bikie world continues to evolve, with new alliances forming and old rivalries taking on new shapes. But the lesson of the rebels' internal war remains clear. In a world built on brotherhood and loyalty, the greatest threat rarely comes from enemies on the outside. It comes from betrayal within. In a criminal landscape where loyalty can be traded, where decades of service can be discarded over suspicion and money, one question still hangs in the air. Who can truly be trusted? The answer may determine which organizations survive and which join the rebels in the graveyard of failed criminal empires. In the end, the rebels learned the hardest lesson of all. An empire built on fear and violence may rise quickly, but it will always carry the seeds of its own destruction.